The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is no substitute for professional care by your doctor or your qualified healthcare professional. Never disregard or delay professional medical advice because of something you've heard on this podcast or in any linked material. Guests who speak on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Dr. Shirley neither endorses nor opposes any particular opinion discussed on this podcast. The views expressed on this podcast have no relation to those of any academic, hospital, practice, institution, or other entity with which Dr. Shirley may be affiliated.
Welcome to Forever FAB, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty. This podcast is curated by Dr. Shirley Madeir, MD, as the definitive source of holistic wellness through beauty.
Welcome back to part 2 of the Forever FAB Podcast with my guest, Jessica Calarco. Now, Jessica, in your most recent book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net, there were many, but this one particular passage really struck me, and I'd like to read it and get your thoughts on it, obviously, and have you explain. The passage begins, resistance to motherhood, or mothering responsibilities, poses a problem for the engineers because trapping girls and women in motherhood is the quickest way to conscript them into doing the work of the social safety net. The engineers could let the reluctant among us off with a free pass, but that might give other women way too many ideas, and the way is my addition. So the engineers construct girls and women as mothers in waiting. They create the perception that every girl should grow up to be a woman, that every woman should be, or at least should want to be, a mother, and that every mother or would-be mother should happily sacrifice herself to care effectively and responsibly for any child who happens to come her way. The engineers can then sit back and wait for girls and women to either be lured into the trap by the power of norms or be pushed in by the power of laws. I read that and thought, OMG, how did this happen? Did I allow this to happen? I myself chose to be childless, but it doesn't matter, because even though I am unknowingly groomed to be a mother in waiting and I chose not to, I feel as if the inequities have been sort of transferred to other aspects of my life, meaning my career, because there's certainly inequities between what a plastic surgeon who looks like me makes and what a plastic surgeon who doesn't look like me and is not of my gender makes. So it seems as if it doesn't really matter if you choose to have children or you get pregnant or you choose not to have children. The inequities are still there. And again, may I say that I believe there's a greater risk for women of color despite their level of education. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly gets at the fact that, and this is part of why the mother in waiting idea is so pernicious, because it gets at this fact that women are treated as future mothers. Girls and women are treated as future mothers, regardless of whether those are their intentions or not, regardless of whether they actually have children. They're sort of discounted oftentimes in the workplace, assumed to be less committed to their jobs, assumed to be, that they'll just kind of, maybe they'll be here for a year or two and then they'll step out, or they won't be able to commit on the job in those kinds of ways. And at the same time, they're also treated as, well, the sort of natural caregivers, the person who's supposed to step in and, plan the office party, the person who's supposed to step in, to fill in the job of a coworker who has caregiving responsibilities. And this was something that, many of the women that I talked to that don't have children during the pandemic, felt an extra level of pressure to fill in for colleagues who had these kinds of extra caregiving responsibilities at home. And many of them also had their own caregiving responsibilities at home in terms of elder care, in terms of community members that they help to care for. And so this is certainly a place where, it's not just motherhood itself that can pull women into these kinds of caregiving, caregiving related exploitations, but it helps this mother in waiting notion makes it seem as though all women are best suited for these kinds of roles in ways that can ultimately reinforce inequities overall.
Yes. And you mentioned also in your book that, if I may quote you, the reward for service is more service, end quote. I read that and I actually wanted to cry because, oh my gosh, I often feel as if I am stuck in this spiraling vortex of service interwoven with sacrifice. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
how do we establish boundaries, and how do we establish boundaries, with compassion and grace, as my Buddhist leanings teach me, or do we just straight up fight with fire and determination and just say no?
Yeah, and then I think this is sort of the tricky part, in the sense that on the one hand, we can push back, and in some cases we can say no, and we can protect our time. But I think this is part of the perniciousness of the system that we live in, and that this is care, and this is oftentimes other people's well-being who gets sacrificed, at least in the absence of the kind of social safety net that we need. If we had a stronger social safety net, if we had protections for all people to have the time to participate in this shared project of care, we didn't disincentivize saying no or disincentivize saying yes so much in terms of the long-term, the long-term health of our societies or our professions or our communities, then we might get, more men, more white people stepping up to say, yeah, sure, I can help with that too. But in the absence of that, we have a system where, if you say no, the risk is that work won't get done or won't get done as well. And so someone else could suffer as a result of that. And, that's the problem with systemic inequities. And one of the reasons why I tell my students that, you can't solve structural problems with individual solutions, in the sense that, individual people making choices is never going to be a way to solve these deep, fundamental structural problems with our society. And really what it takes is better policy. That might be policies that say, actually we need to ratchet back the workload that's associated with any given job, or we need to formalize these kinds of often unpaid or, fluffy sorts of service roles that don't really fit anywhere into job descriptions. We need to actually say that's part of your paid work. We're going to compensate you for it. Or we need to say, hey, the job that you're doing is actually two people's jobs. We need to divide this. We need to better staff our workplaces in ways that make this kind of work more sustainable. There's so many ways that we can use policy, both governmental policy and organizational policy, to address some of these challenges. But too often, I feel like it gets pushed onto, women in particular, and often women of color, who are pulled, in so many directions service-wise, to have to, feel like they either need to protect themselves by saying no, or potentially put their, the people around them at risk by saying yes, or by not saying yes at the same time.
Right. Exactly. You tell the story of a couple in your book, both of whom are working and therefore dual incomes. But the end of that story is such that women in dual income families, they don't get it any easier.
Yeah, and certainly I think this is very much the case for many of the women that we talked to in that kind of a position where, even in cases where mothers are the breadwinners, where women are the primary breadwinners in their household. There's one couple in the book, that the mom I call Virginia. She's a college professor, and she's the primary breadwinner, makes about $75,000 a year. But her husband's a middle school math teacher, makes about $45,000 a year. And at the same time, she's the primary breadwinner, but this is consistent with survey data, she's still the one that does the bulk of the childcare, that does the bulk of the housework, that does the bulk of the caring for her elderly parents too, even though her brother could do more. And essentially this gets at, what the research tells us on that front is that men often feel threatened in their masculinity when they have partners who earn more than they do, women partners who earn more than they do. And so women often end up feeling compelled to do more of that labor to help sort of, avoid those emotional gaps. And then it's also amplified often by, structural conditions, in the sense that, in Virginia's family, she was the one who had the more flexible work schedule. She could do some of her work remotely, where her husband's job had to be done, at the physical school, in ways that made it easy for her to become the default parent, the one who, if the kids had, a snow day, or if someone got sick, there was a series of weeks during the pandemic when her childcare center kept closing and reclosing and reclosing. And she was complaining about how, she'd paid $2,000 a month for care and gotten a handful of days over the past 6 weeks. And it was just one of those moments where she felt deeply frustrated. And certainly she knew what the problems were. She said, the institutions don't care about you. I need better policies in place. But at the same time, it was a situation that she just couldn't solve on her own.
Right. So let's go back to the crafty engineers, those sly foxes that they are, for one moment. How are these engineers gaslighting women on a massive and systemic scale, specifically regarding higher education and, dare I say, entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I mean, this is a place where women are told, if you just make the right choices, if you just make good choices, you should be fine. If you find the right partner, if you, get the right degrees, if you go to the right schools, if you choose the right career paths, if you start your own business, that you should be able to be, self-sustaining, that you shouldn't ever end up in poverty, that you shouldn't ever end up sort of struggling economically or socially in our society. And, the reality here is that, and certainly they can even point to survey data, showing, hey, the women who wait to have children until they're older, or the women who get married tend to be, are less likely to fall into poverty later in life. But what that risks is conflating correlation with causation, in the sense that the kinds of women and the kinds of people who are in the position to make those, quote unquote, good choices are often people with high levels of privilege, people who are able to invest time. And like we saw with Brooke, in terms of, who gets pushed out of college and what is the role that things like our, lack of access to reproductive health care, plays in pushing women out of college. And so it's not that she didn't want to finish college. If anything, she very much wanted to finish her degree. And even after her son was born, she kept trying to find ways to make it work, she thought maybe I could become a nurse and maybe that would put me on the path to stability. But she didn't. She'd grown up in a very difficult home life and didn't trust her parents to care for her son. And at the same time, was working full time during the day and needed to support her family, and, didn't have any options for childcare, for night classes. And so couldn't figure out a way to get this degree that she needed to be able to get ahead, to be able to even have a shot at having a higher paying job. And so these are places where it's very easy for, the sort of myths in our society to tell people you should just make better choices. You should just, right, do all these things, when in reality that the deck is stacked against so many of us.
Right. Right. Now we are all taught this in some form or another, the success sequence. Work hard, make good choices, you will reap the benefits. From my experience, I'm not quite sure that it worked exactly that way. And why doesn't it work?
Yeah, and I think this gets again at the idea that there's often privilege undergirding the ability to make the kinds of choices that are associated with better outcomes in our society, and that if we ignore the role that privilege plays, then we kind of can easily misinterpret those choices themselves as the driving forces behind success or a lack of precarity, as opposed to recognizing that the deck is stacked in these kinds of ways. And at the same time, we have to think about how our society could be structured very differently. We could kind of put in place the kinds of things like free college tuition would have made a difference for Brooke, would have made a difference for Patricia in terms of being able to access higher paying jobs, and not have student loan debt hanging over her head from trying to finish a college degree. So there's so many ways that we even penalize people for striving, especially if they come from backgrounds where they don't have that kind of resource support to help them make those good choices along the way.
So there are a few things I believe that, just to sort of summarize what you just said, that play a role in quote unquote making good choices. One, you mentioned privilege, which I didn't even think about that. The two is lack of precarity. And I think the third would be the absence of adversity. Right? There are some people who encounter obstacles and adversity, and for them that's just it. It's just too big of an obstacle. There are other people who are able to drive right through it, past, and just bulldoze their way through it, but yet the adversity becomes more intense, more sophisticated, more pervasive on different levels, and then boom, you just get stopped right there.
And actually what the research shows us on that front too is that, especially for people from kind of racially marginalized groups in our society, that being kind of pushed into that mindset of you just have to push through it, you just have to keep kind of being resilient in the face of adversity, it can actually lead to worse health outcomes and worse mental health outcomes over time. So yes, you may experience that success, but it can take a toll on your physical body, on your mental health, on your well-being in ways that can, jeopardize outcomes long-term. And so I think we have to recognize that, yes, some people may be able to kind of power through or bulldoze their way through those barriers, but that doesn't come without a substantial cost.
Okay. Now, this is a two-part question. You mentioned that there are some things that we are all taught that we should strive for. And yet these subtitles, a couple of subtitles in your book, pretty much say that these things won't save women. So marriage won't save women, and college won't save women. Now I have a string of letters behind my name and the student loans to prove it. So what is the alternative thinking that we should be talking to our children or even ourselves about as we're about to make, choices about whether or not we go for, a PhD or get another, master's or another kind of doctorate,
I mean,
and whether or
certainly,
not we get married.
yeah.
That's the second part of the question.
Yeah, and so certainly it's not that, having these degrees isn't associated with better outcomes in our society. And that certainly there are, lots of reasons to get a college degree, lots of reasons to pursue higher education. But the idea that that alone is the sort of ticket to success or a guaranteed pathway to success is part of how we justify underinvesting in things like affordable college tuition or even free college tuition, which many other countries do. We tell people, oh, this is going to be such a benefit for your future that you'll be able to pay it off. Don't worry about those loans. Don't worry about it, down the line. If you make this right choice, you'll be rewarded handsomely in the end in ways that will make it all kind of wash out. And that may have been the case at some points in our history, but certainly today, with higher rates of college enrollment and with the sort of changing norms around college degrees, what this means is that it doesn't have the same payoff that it used to. And so you often need more and more and more degrees, which in this system that we live in also often means more and more and more debt to go along with it, to the point where, and part of this, it's oftentimes blamed on colleges and universities simply raising their tuitions. But part of the reality here is that states and governments have systematically de-invested in public education in particular. That public college and university tuition used to be heavily subsidized by taxpayer dollars, in the sense that you could get, you could go to a public university for the equivalent of a couple of $100s per semester, decades ago, in ways that now those tuition rates have ratcheted up and up in ways that make that less and less affordable, especially for students who are trying to go out of state or who are trying to kind of move elsewhere for college. Public education is still a fairly good, investment relative to, the cost of private education. But this is a place where if we invested, more public tuition dollars, if we invested more in making public education at the post K-12 level much more accessible, much more affordable, not by forcing universities to tighten their budgets, but instead by saying we're going to invest public money in this to make these kinds of degrees, to treat it like a sort of natural extension of high school, in a way that gives people more choices about whether to pursue those kinds of degrees. Then that would both to help alleviate some of that sort of competitive pressure and at the same time actually make college degrees pay off for people in ways that they can't right now, because of the high levels of debt that often come with them, and debt that is disproportionately borne by people of color because of the sort of wealth disparities, and especially women of color who are often in a position where they are disproportionately going to get these degrees, and also facing the kinds of caregiving burdens that can make it difficult for them to finish without a degree, which means that they end up, with the debt and without the degree that could potentially get them a better job down the line.
Right. Well, personal example, I definitely have massive amounts of student debt, and you would think that with the career that I've chosen that I would have been able to just eradicate those, summarily in a relatively quick amount of time. Not the case at all. And so I believe that educational debt is yet another thing that keeps women in general down, but certainly, to your point, women of color down, because there isn't anyone in my family who can help me get rid of that debt. And it just hangs above my head and around my neck like an albatross. For sure.
Absolutely. And this is playing a role for many families in their decisions about, whether to buy a house, whether to have another child, whether to have kids at all in the first place. I mean, this in some cases, this is tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that individuals or couples are holding between them, and that are affecting their ability to make the kinds of quote unquote good choices that we see as sort of necessary for a good life in our society, let alone kind of a lack of precarity or stability.
Right. Long ago, I once attended a Tony Robbins event where I learned, quote, change your mind, change your state, end quote, as sort of an attribute or a positive thinking, right? It was about the power of positive thinking. Why is this not the whole truth? And being a wellness advocate, in addition to, a beauty and plastic surgery person, the wellness industry is rife with this sort of, magical thinking. If you just think your way through with positive affirmations every day, your life will be transformed. They just don't, either they don't work or they don't work for everyone. And my question to you is a mindset reset truly the first step to prosperity, success, and ultimately happiness?
Yeah, and this gets at sort of the second half of the book tackles what I talk about as myths in our society, myths that operate to delude us into believing that we don't need a social safety net, that we can get by, on our own merits or on our own efforts or on our own good choices, and that also operate to divide us by race and class and gender and politics and religion in ways that lead us to judge each other, oftentimes for making those quote unquote bad choices, or for, not making the same choices that we do, in ways that keep us from coming together to fight for that stronger social safety net. And this kind of, power of positive thinking ideology is very closely linked to what I talk about in the book as the myth of meritocracy, which is this belief that if people just have the right mindset, if they just work hard enough, if they just believe that they can succeed, that will be enough in the end. And the problem there is that ignores, the deep structural inequalities in our society. It ignores the fact that many people face that adversity, face that oppression, face the lack of good choices available to them. And so then, the kind of, that power of positive thinking mantra tells us that if it kind of measures people on their success and says, if they didn't succeed, it must just be that they didn't work hard enough, or they just didn't want it enough, or they just didn't care enough. And so that essentially then operates to justify our lack of investment in a social safety net. Because if you believe that the person in poverty must be in poverty because they, didn't have the right mindset or didn't make the right choices, then it becomes very easy to justify. Yes, exactly. Then what that suggests is that, okay, well, then they don't deserve support. And it undermines our sense of the deservingness of people who are facing real structural challenges, and leads us to do things like, in Indiana, where many of the couples that many of the families that I interviewed came from, the most that a single mom of two can get from welfare is $287 a month. And that is, and at the same time, she has to find a job immediately to even be able to keep those benefits. And she's also, in many places around this country, potentially could be subjected to drug tests or subjected to stigma and scrutiny, for being in these programs. So we not only, don't give people the support that they need, but we stigmatize them and we penalize them. And so much of this comes from those kinds of myth of meritocracy ideas and how they lead us to, to judge others who are just a little bit lower on the, the economic strata than we are. And I talk in the book about a white evangelical Christian mom who she and her family get by on only $30,000 a year from her husband's job as a pastor at their church. And yet she rejects any sort of efforts to, strengthen the social safety net, universal childcare, universal health care, higher minimum wage laws, in part because she defines herself by the fact that my family doesn't need that support. We're able to get by without it. Now, ironically, she's ignoring the fact that her parents helped her pay for college. Her parents helped her with a down payment on a house. And that's part of why she's able to get by on $30,000 a year. But at the same time, she's able to use those kinds of, power of positive thinking or myth of meritocracy ideas to say, well, we worked hard, so that's why we are where we are. And they must just be making bad choices, often drawing on some sexist and racist rhetoric, saying those other moms, they must be going out partying, they must be getting their nails done if they're, as opposed to, needing money to put food on the table for their kids.
Wow. So what does a stronger social safety net look like? And is it something that has to be developed by society at large, by government, or is there something that individuals can help to develop as well?
Yeah, so I think of a social safety net as kind of an investment in our shared project of care. And there's lots of ways to do this. And the first is to help people live with dignity. And I think this is a place where government can play a very strong role in terms of just helping people to meet their basic needs for food, for shelter, for access to, clean water even, which is not a given in many parts of our country. Kind of meeting those basic needs for people throughout their lives. Healthcare is another one that we simply don't guarantee here in ways that other countries do. So that's one key piece of it that government is often best suited to play a role in doing, is to kind of provide that foundational basis. The next key piece here is to help people reach economic opportunities. And certainly, this is a place where governments, again, can play a foundational role by investing in things like public education, by investing in things like childcare programs, or by investing in communities also. At the same time, there is a role here for foundations or donors to play in helping to support and strengthen the basis of, access to opportunities that exist in our society, especially if we don't have, the tax rates where they need to be. This is another place where we've seen, some wives of big billionaires, giving money back, or ex-wives in many cases, in ways that have been, transformational to many communities in the US and abroad. And these are, alternative ways of making that happen in the absence of massive changes to policy. At the same time, I think the third piece of it is this idea of helping people to have the time and energy that they need to contribute to this shared project of care. And this, again, can come from government policies in terms of things like guaranteed paid family leave, guaranteed paid sick leave, and paid vacation time, the way that many other countries have. It can include things like limits on paid work hours, 4-day work weeks. And these are, in the absence of large-scale government policies, they're also things that individual employers or individual states, in some cases, have done to push for those kinds of policies. And, we've seen states like Minnesota, which have invested in a number of these types of policies, kind of offering a model for what could this look like at the national level, that this is doable in our society, in ways that, many people say, oh, this just can't be done here, it's too costly. But what the research tells us and what the evidence tells us, on the ground, just looking at it, is that this is very doable here, and that there's things that we can do on lots of different levels to make this possible for all of us.
I am so glad to hear that it is possible. Things can get better. There is hope.
Yes. And you asked about the individual level too. And I think I think one thing that individuals can do is to notice when they are falling into mythical thinking, and to notice when others are, and to call ourselves out and to call others in, to think about, why might those kinds of myths be a problematic way to think about our society, and how might those myths be leading us to acknowledge the importance of a social safety net, and to focus on fighting with each other as opposed to how we could come together. And this is another place where kind of keeping in mind that we are all part of communities of care, in the sense that even if you are, say, not a parent, if you have a colleague who's a parent and their childcare provider gets sick, you're going to have to take on more work to fill in for them while they are out. And so recognizing that our investments in care infrastructure affect all of us, that we'll all give and receive care at different points in our lives, and we're all connected to people who are in different caregiving or care receiving roles. And so this is places where we can come together as individuals to say, how can we find connections in our community, find other people that we can collaborate with and coordinate with, to say, okay, how can we fight together for the kinds of policies or for the kinds of programs that would better support the care for all of us that needs to happen in our communities and our families.
Thank you for that, Jessica. I do think it is absolutely essential that we all remember that we are part of, not only smaller communities, but the larger community in general, and that to remember that we are all connected, and to remember, as you said, that at some point in our lives, we will be on the other end, right? Not always on the giving end, but on the receiving end. And we can only hope that there will be someone there for us as we were there for someone else.
Yes, very much so.
Thank you. I cannot believe we've come to the last question, because honestly, this has been such a brilliant conversation, and one that is absolutely critical to our lives as women and as parts of a larger community. So this last question is the Fab Five, and it is the signature question of the Forever FAB podcast. And the question is, what are your top 5 recommendations for living a beautiful, fabulous, and most empowered life?
Yeah, I think that I would start here again with this idea of community and care. And maybe this is kind of two things together, is to first kind of center care in your life in ways that help to recognize the work of the people caring around you, and also to think about, how can I contribute, not only for many of us, this is work that we're already doing, but for those who aren't, how can I contribute more sustainably? How can I contribute more equitably, to the work of care that's happening in my community? And that certainly brings us to the second piece, which is about kind of focusing on, it's so easy, especially in the midst of the kind of myths that we have, to focus on ourselves and to just focus on, how do I avoid precarity? How do I help myself get ahead? But remembering that we are part of these larger communities, I think is essential to, not only given what we know about the importance of connection for our well-being, for our health, for our mental health, but also for, the sustainability of these kinds of communities. And so I think those are probably two of the key things here. I think the third thing would be, to reject the kind of gaslighting that so many of us are subject to, that it's easy, especially in the context of, myths that tell us that we should just be making these good choices, to blame ourselves and to hold ourselves, to feel feel like we have to hold ourselves accountable when things aren't going right in our life. And related to that, this kind of rejecting this gaslighting often means looking to the structures, seeing the kinds of, the hidden mechanisms, the hidden architecture behind the scenes that is structuring the society that we're in, and kind of acknowledging those structures and seeing how they shape our lives in ways that are often beyond our control. And then maybe the last thing would be to kind of come back together to find ways to coordinate with other people, to see those structures not as fixed, but as surmountable through the kind of work that we do, with other people and through our collaborative efforts, to push back against those systems of change. That at least for now, we still live in a democracy. And so it's possible for us, with the right level of support, with the right level of community investment and coming together to push back and demand those kinds of changes that would better support us all.
That is a fabulous Fab Five.
I don't know if it was exactly 5, but I will do my best. Yeah.
It was perfect. Thank you, Jessica, for your energetic presence on the Forever FAB podcast. This brings us to our close of this week's episode of the Forever FAB podcast with my guest, Jessica Calarco. Thank you for listening to this week's Forever FAB episode. Until next time, stay beautiful and forever fabulous inside and out. Learn more about Jessica and her work and her book on jessicacalarco.com.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Forever FAB, the podcast on fashion, the art of living, and all things beauty, curated by Dr. Shirley Madere, MD. Live beautifully and help make the world a more beautiful place.